I predicted in that column, on the basis primarily of the experience with Prohibition, that drug prohibition would be ineffective in cutting down the number of addicts, and that it would promote a crime and corruption. And as we all recognize, one of the major harms which is being done by the broader extension of governmental activity is that it prevents government from doing those things which I believe only it can do effectively. When people talk about the innocent victims of the war on drugs, they very often forget the people who suffer robberies, theft, murder, not because they get caught in crossfires, not because they're in drug wars, not because of addicts who are trying to support their habit, but simply because all of the police and the enforcement offices are being used to try to control drugs, and there aren't enough people, there aren't enough resources left to maintain, to prevent theft and burglary and the rest in the rest of the community. The second lesson I think we should learn, and probably the more important lesson, is that we are likely to make more progress on the war against the war on drugs if we recognize its link to this broader problem of cutting down the scope and power of the government and restoring power to the people. In the case of drugs, the major effect of drug prohibition is to multiply the number of innocent victims, not to reduce them. The reason why the prohibition of drugs is not a case of the administration of justice is because the drug user, whether he's smart or foolish or not, harms primarily himself. Now, there is a case for doing something in which the drug user harms other people, and we do. The case of alcohol is very simple. The driver, the person who drives when he's drunk, there is an argument, clearly should be prosecuted for that. It's the act of driving while drunk, not the act of drinking, for which he should be prosecuted. And similarly, if people under the influence of drugs do a similar thing, the act of doing that thing is what should be prosecuted, not the ingestion of the drugs. See, I think there are two arguments, as I've always argued, for drug prohibition. One is from principle, that people ought to be responsible for themselves, and the government has no business telling me what to ingest. This is, I'm sure, the argument I'm sure this is the argument you heard very effectively from Dr. Sauce. But there's also the question of expediency. The question, for a moment, waive the question of principle. Are you doing more harm than good? And there, the evidence seems to me so overwhelming that it appeals to people who will not join you on matters of principle.
I see America with half the number of prisons, half the number of prisoners, 10,000 fewer homicides a year, inner cities in which there's a chance for these poor people to live without being afraid for their lives, respectable citizens who are now citizens who might be respectable who are now addicts, not being subject to becoming criminals in order to get their drug, being able to get drugs for which they're sure of the quality. I grew up, I'm old enough to have lived through some part of the Prohibition era.
And you remember it?
I remember. I remember the occasion when a fellow graduate student at Columbia from Sweden wanted to take me downtown to a restaurant where we had a Swedish meal and introduced me to the Swedish drink aquavit. This was a restaurant at which this Swedish fellow had been getting aquavit all during Prohibition. They'd been selling it to him. And this was just after the repeal of Prohibition. And we went there, and he asked them for some aquavit. He said, "Oh, no, we haven't gotten our license yet." And finally, he talked to them in Swedish and persuaded them to take us into the back where the kitchen where they gave us a glass of aquavit apiece. Now, that shows the absurdity of it. During Prohibition, when I was a teenager. Prohibition was repealed in 1933 when I was 21 years old. So I was a teenager during most of Prohibition. Alcohol was readily available. Bootlegging was common. Any idea that alcohol prohibition was keeping people from drinking was absurd. There were speakeasies all over the place, but more than that. We had this spectacle of Al Capone, of the hijackings, of the gang wars. Anybody with two eyes to see. Again, I wasn't a great imbiber of liquor. I may have gone to a speakeasy or so, I don't remember, but I'm not saying I didn't. But I wasn't an alcoholic or anything. Anybody with two eyes to see could see that this was a bad deal, that you were doing more harm than good. The case for prohibiting drugs is exactly as strong and as weak as a case for prohibiting people from overeating. We all know that overeating causes more deaths than drugs do. Why isn't it perfect if it's in principle okay for the government to say you must not consume drugs because they do you harm? Why isn't it all right to say you must not eat too much because you do harm? Why isn't it all right to say you must not try to go in for skydiving because you're likely to die? Why isn't it all right to say, oh, skiing, that's no good, that's a very dangerous sport, you'll hurt yourself? Where do you draw the line? There are an enormous number of innocent victims now. You've got the people whose purses are stolen, who are bashed over the head by people trying to get enough money for their next fix. You've got the people killed in the random drug wars. You've got the corruption of the legal establishment. You've got the innocent victims of the taxpayers who have to pay for more and more prisons and more prisoners and more policemen. You've got the rest of us who don't get decent law enforcement because all the law enforcement officials are busy trying to do the impossible problem. And, not last but not least, you've got the people of Colombia and Peru and so on. The economics part of it is, I'm an economist, but the economics problem is strictly tertiary. It's a moral problem. It's a problem of the harm which government is doing. Look, I have estimated statistically that the prohibition of drugs produces, on the average, 10,000 additional homicides a year. It's a moral problem that the government is going around killing 10,000 people. It's a moral problem that the government is making into criminals people who may be doing something you and I don't approve of, but who are doing something that hurts nobody else. Most of the arrests for drugs are for possession by casual users. Now, here's somebody who wants to smoke a cigarette, a joint, a marijuana cigarette. If he's caught, he goes to jail. Now, is that moral? Is that proper? I think it's absolutely disgraceful that our government, supposed to be our government, should be in the position of converting people who are not harming others into criminals, of destroying their life, putting them in jail. If you look at it from a purely economic point of view, the role of the government is to protect the drug cartel. That's literally true.
Is it doing a good job with it?
Excellent. What do I mean by that? In an ordinary free market business, let's take potatoes, beef, anything you want, there are thousands of importers and exporters. Anybody can go into the business. But it's very hard for a small person to go into the drug importing business because our interdiction efforts essentially make it enormously costly. So the only people who can survive in that business are these large meddling cartel kind of people who have enough money so they can have fleets of airplanes, so they can have sophisticated methods, so on. So in effect, in addition to which, by keeping goods out, by arresting, let's say, local marijuana growers, the government keeps the price of these products high. So what more could a monopolist want? He's got a government who makes it very hard for all his competitors and who keeps the price of his product high. It's absolutely heaven. I would legalize drugs by subjecting them to exactly the same rules that alcohol and cigarettes are subjected to now. Alcohol and cigarettes cause more deaths than drugs do by far from use, but many fewer innocent victims. Nothing scares me about the notion of drugs being legal.
Nothing.
What scares me is a notion of continuing on the path we're on now, which will destroy our free society, making it an uncivilized place. The attempt to prohibit drugs has done far more harm than good. I think that prohibition of drugs is the most immoral program that the United States has ever engaged in. If you take laws against murder or theft,
Right.
there's a victim who has an interest in reporting it. So if somebody has a burglary, he calls the cops, and the cops come and investigate. Now, in drug issue, when you try to prevent somebody from ingesting something he wants to ingest, you have a willing buyer and a willing seller. There's a deal made.
No one has an interest in reporting it?
And so the only way you can enforce it is through informers. The attempt to prohibit drugs is one of the main reasons for the destruction of the ghettos in our cities. The people who would benefit most from legalization are the addicts. Without making things illegal, things can also be affected. Look at what's happened in smoking. Tobacco kills far more people than drugs do, by a multiple. By information, by knowledge, you've had a strong reduction in smoking.
Television
Teenagers tend to be attracted to drugs by the fact that they're illegal. In my opinion, there's no evidence whatsoever that legalizing drugs would cause any major increase in usage. I think you have periods when drug use goes up, periods when drug use goes down, as you do with all other human phenomena. And I think that what you have to take into account is the enormous amount of harm that the attempt to prohibit drugs does to our system of laws, to our civil liberties, to human freedom, and that we'd be more effective
Pete Wilson, you've got about 20
in reducing the
seconds
use of drugs
for a
by
closing statement.
persuasion.